After Adam was listed as missing in action, the tragedy encircling him and Holly began fading away from the Christian memories of the residents of Garrett, Colorado. 3 years following Adam's disappearance, his mother and father were lost in a head-on collision on the way home from Sterling. When the estate was settled, the house and farm were left to Anne, who, along with her freeloading husband, began selling off parceled lots of the farm's acreage until the only land that remained was the 7 acres where the house and barn sat. Adam's car remained in the barn. While the chopper's main rotor blades began speeding up, Adam jumped on last, for he knew that he would always be the first off. Gazing about the interior of the helicopter, he immediately noticed that ropes and rappelling gear were on hand, which meant that they would have to rappel into the jungle, and he hated grounding himself that way, for he and his team could easily become dangling sniper bait. During the helicopter's gradual lift from the helo pad, Adam leaned toward the door gunner. "Why do we have to rappel? I distinctly remember that big-assed Buddha we passed an hour ago. If I'm correct, we shouldn't be far from the Ho Chi Minh Trail." As Mike was about to respond, the echoing voices of the Vietnamese language began sounding in the silence behind them, and small arms fire began sounding ahead. Straining their ears toward the direction of the voices, the team abruptly dove for cover in the heavy undergrowth when the approaching sight of a platoon of North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas moving rapidly toward their rendezvous point raised the alarm. Staring curiously at the fast-moving enemy troops, who were several yards away, Adam noticed that they seemed to be transparent, almost like ghosts. Turning to Mike and the others, he could tell that they were witnessing the same thing. While holding their positions, moving truck, the professor returned to his lane of traffic and glanced askance at Randy. "In this world, if you have the proper credentials, you can acquire just about any knowledge you wish, whether top secret or not." "Well, how do you do it? I mean, by being a professor at a university?" Randy returned. "I would think you'd be extremely limited to what the government wants you to know." The professor grinned. "On the contrary," he replied, "they use my knowledge sometimes regarding the activities of cults, fanatical religious sects, hate groups, and the rites and rituals of the dark arts." "I've never thought that the government would be interested in such things," Randy responded. The deputy then began twitching, convulsing, turning, and smoking until he burst into a huge ball of flames. With an abrupt reaction, the 6 firemen, who were putting their hoses away on their truck, suddenly began frantically pulling them off again and hurrying to the barn. While the firemen began hosing down the deputy in hay bales, the other deputy stepped up next to Randy and pointed at Adam's car. "You weren't kidding when you said that car was haunting, were you?" he nervously asked. "No, sir, I was not kidding," Randy sternly answered. "And if I were you, I would get out of here before Adam comes after you, too." Glancing behind him, Randy saw that the professor, Jenny, and Anne were rapidly approaching him. Turning toward the professor, who appeared shaken, Randy stepped up to him and anxiously said, "Someone has washed the bloody rune signs off Holly's grave." Accompanied by its corresponding muzzle flash erupt from behind a large oak tree in the yard, he saw, in the shadows, that there was no rifle and no one pulling a trigger. The sergeant stepped up to the hood of the Jeep, stood down, and, after resting his rifle and scope on the hood, began a sweep with the starlight scope. Keeping the scope to the shadows and the darkness, occasionally being blinded by a house light, he pulled his eye from the scope and turned to the captain. "There is no target, sir," he announced. "What the hell are we doing here? We're literally fighting an invisible enemy." The sound of a vehicle approaching brought the captain's attention to the sheriff's car, which slowed down and then pulled up behind the Jeep. Exiting the patrol car, the sheriff and Randy, ducking down in case of an errant bullet, rushed up to the captain. "Where is he?" the sheriff asked, staring at the wood-framed house that was being riddled with a seemingly endless salvo of bullets from an automatic weapon. The captain pointed toward the large tree a few yards away. "As far as we know, he's behind that tree. We just can't see him."